Tens of thousands of children around the world are given guns to fight wars. But what happens when conflicts end and child soldiers have to go home? What horrors have they seen and suffered? How do they integrate back into society? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Some haven't even reached their teenage years. Children as young as 11 or 12 recruited as soldiers in armed conflicts. Whether on the front line or in support roles, they're exposed not only to bloody fights and violent death, but also to enslavement and sexual abuse. So who's employing them, and what can be done to stop them joining the ranks of armed groups? Some of them state-funded. And where's the help for them once they lay down their weapons? Well, let's go first to our reporter, Ahmed Idris, who's in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Ahmed recently returned from Liberia, where around 35,000 children fought for rebel leader Charles Taylor during 14 years of a war that killed 250,000 people. Ahmed, so 14 years after the end of the war, how are former child soldiers in Liberia rehabilitating into normal life? Are they?
Well, basically, apart from the 35,000 that fought for child soldiers, for Charles Taylor, there are thousands more who fought for other warlords. And now, meeting them in Liberia and other parts of Liberia, we made contact with some of them. We've seen so many of them, but these are people who don't feel safe in their own communities. They prefer to live in the slums. A lot of the child soldiers or former child soldiers don't want to go back home because they feel they're not safe. And for the communities they live inside Monrovia and around Monrovia, they feel they are shunned by these communities. They are afraid not only of what they did in the past, but also for their future. We've met some of them at the West Point, where a lot of them gather these days, and they're not happy with what is happening right now in their lives.
A small group of former child soldiers in Liberia try to comfort each other. Bonding is something society failed to provide. That's all some of them do these days. They were barely 12 when they were forced to fight. Christopher was captured by rebels and given a weapon when he was 11 years old. Now 24 and already a father. He has little hope for the future.
I feel too sad, man. I feel different, yeah, because the war is not good. They don't give us training like skills. They just give us money. You see me? They owe me, they use just money. They don't care of training, practice, no.
That money was $150 paid to each combatant for handing in their weapon. Many did not. His exploits during the war landed him the leading role in a movie called Johnny Mad Dog, showing the horrors of the Liberian War. But it wasn't seen in Liberian cinemas because it was banned.
Most of the child soldiers lack basic skills and education to compete in a post-war Liberia. Some of them have been in and out of prisons several times. Slums like the West Point provide refuge for them. Here, they feel more at home than in the organized settings of a city.
With my friends.
At 25, Princess is a mother of two, now hooked on hard drugs. She handed in her weapon from the war, but with both parents killed in fighting, she has nowhere else to go. And she is in an abusive relationship.
Not do nonsense for me. So when I want to sport to me, it makes me not feel bad.
That's the harsh reality she and thousands of other former combatants live. As a former child soldier, she was feared. Now she lives in constant fear. And there is fear elsewhere because petty theft, illegal drugs, and prostitution are common.
They're not going to go away, and that resentment is going to come. The resentment is going to be against the society.
And that is a threat neither Liberia or its neighbors are adequately prepared to deal with right now.
Now, basically, these child soldiers, ex-child soldiers, have nothing to do apart from petty crimes like some of the people we met in Liberia are talking about. So wherever they go, they are not taken in, or rather they're not respected, they're not received well, and the rehabilitation process doesn't even start for them. A lot of them are still traumatized by the war. A lot of them feel a lot of anger because of what the future holds for them. Virtually the future holds nothing for them. We've spoke to some of them and they are not happy about how it has been handled from the start up to this moment.
All right, so what is the Liberian government doing, Ahmed, to help to integrate these people back into society?
Well, it started some years ago. Unfortunately, the Liberian government didn't have the finances or didn't have the money and the political will to see it through. And there was little or no help from the international communities to sort of counsel these young people and offer them some physical, for some training and of course some advice or even some motivation to engage in skills so that they can organize or reorganize their lives. When it all started, there was expectation from international bodies, the United Nations and other donor agencies. A lot of these child soldiers were expecting a lot more than the $150 paid to them so that they can invest or rather start some small-scale businesses they can sort of build their lives around. Unfortunately, that didn't come. And for people who are shunned by communities or their communities and who are rejected by their own people, especially those who still have parents and relations in the villages, it's been a difficult period for them. And right now, without skills, without the money, and without the attention needed from the government and international donors, they feel the future is not very good at all. So many of them have taken to crime.
Ahmed, many thanks indeed. Ahmed Idris there, reporting from Abuja. Well, let's bring our guests in for today's discussion. From Paris, we're joined by Theresa Betancourt, Associate Professor of Child Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. And Finbarr O'Reilly joins us, former Reuters correspondent in West and Central Africa for 12 years. Theresa, let's start with you. Before we talk about the rehabilitation of child soldiers, the world has made great strides towards the abolition of the use of child soldiers in armed conflict, but the problem still exists. How big is it? Who are the main culprits?
Well, these numbers are hard to arrive at, but by most estimates, it's upwards of 250,000 children involved in armed conflicts around the world at any one given time. We have to remember this involves boys as well as girls. Girls have been found in just about every region of the world where children have been involved with armed forces and armed groups. In places where I've worked, like northern Uganda and Sierra Leone, children were forcibly abducted, but also we see other situations in which children may be manipulated or forced by third-party actors to become involved. And we have to really understand the complexity of the issue and the many push and pull factors that contribute to that.
Finbarr, from your experience, what are these children conscripted to do, and why? I mean, why are kids used in times of war?
Well, from my experience covering conflicts in places like Congo, Sudan, Chad, and a little bit in the post-war Liberia and Sierra Leone, generally what happens is, children are more easily manipulated. They are more easily coerced. They don't have a sort of ability to have independent thinking or to resist any kind of orders. They also consume less food, and with the light weapons these days, they can conduct combat with small arms. So generally what tends to happen is the boys will be often used for frontline fighting, and the girls will be used as sort of support, whether that involves cooking and collecting food or firewood and transporting a lot of the goods, although the boys would be forced to carry food and materials as well. But the women, of course, are also used as sex slaves and as wives for the various commanders. And there is also, of course, sexual violence against the boys as well. And so these roles are sort of defined by gender, but not exclusively so.
Theresa, what consequences do girls in particular suffer as a result of their gender then?
Well, and speaking about this topic, I'm drawing from our 15-year intergenerational study of war, which has been following a cohort of 529 young people at the end of Sierra Leone's civil war in 2001, 2002, up until the present. So we've had 4 waves of data collection. About a third of the sample are female, and they were 10 to 17 when we first enrolled them in the study in 2002. And we've seen a number of factors that shape how young people reintegrate over time. Some of these applied to both girls and boys, including some of the young people in our sample who are worst off are those who come back to experience community stigma, not having social support and acceptance from members of their family, and then poor access to getting back into school and other forms of advancing themselves through livelihoods. For girls, we see sort of a double indemnity, that they have much higher rates of exposure to sexual violence. In our sample in Sierra Leone, it was upwards of 45%, and that's likely underreported. But about 5% of the male sample also reported sexual abuse. What we see with the double indemnity is that girls not only experience higher rates of exposure to these sorts of traumas, but they're also seen with tremendous stigma as defiled when they return to their communities and unmarriageable. So for a young person to reintegrate into society, being seen as someone not worthy of marriage, not accepted by the community, is extremely marginalizing and ostracizing. And those sorts of community dynamics and family dynamics are some that we care about a great deal in terms of how we address them in programming, as well as addressing individual trauma and ensuring that mental health programs are evidence-based and that they're linked to life opportunities to get back into school and to pursue a livelihood.
And Theresa, is the use of girls in armed conflict worse in any particular part of the world? I'm thinking about Boko Haram in northern Nigeria and their use of female suicide bombers.
Well, it's horrible just about anywhere we see the involvement of children in armed forces and armed groups. It's really hard to put a qualitative judgment on that. Certainly we're seeing in recent times increased involvement of children in such nefarious actions and manipulation to be suicide bombers. That was not the case in Sierra Leone, although both girls and boys were sent as sort of frontline forces to check out a village before conducting raids. And the exposure that both boys and girls experience in armed conflict is horrific in just about every setting that we've seen it in.
Finbarr, to what extent is the outsourcing of military operations to private security companies, which we've seen much more of late, making the problem harder to tackle, in that governments don't know who is subcontracting to who and who they're employing?
Well, that's not something that I've encountered myself. I certainly didn't see that working in Africa, and there may be some of that in parts of the Middle East and with the various proxy groups that are fighting, but I've not seen the subcontracting to armed groups in the way that you're suggesting with regards to child soldiers. What you do see is different foreign armies in a place like Congo. So you would have Rwandan forces and Ugandan forces, and sometimes Angolan or Zimbabwean troops, all in Congo fighting and bringing in child soldiers from the local communities, either coerced or forced into these frontline kinds of positions that we're talking about, where they do some of the fighting, or they function as sort of support for the forces who are in combat, or even just occupying certain areas where there may be natural resources that are of interest to the different fighting groups. But in terms of foreign contractors, that's not something that I've personally encountered in my work.
All right, you talk about child soldiers moving across borders. What about former child soldiers being recruited as mercenaries to fight in conflicts away from their home countries, in that they even as they grow into adulthood, that they never get away from this conscription?
Well, certainly in places like Central Africa, that you would see the flow of children from Central African Republic or from Sudan or from Uganda moving across borders with the different rebel groups or militias as they did that. So yes, they can very easily get caught up and swept up in sort of longer term migrations. And you would have seen that certainly with the Lord's Resistance Army that started out in northern Uganda, but has since moved across large swaths of territory into South Sudan, into parts of Congo, and even down into the Central African Republic. And for those children to eventually return home, if they ever do, is a very difficult thing just in terms of the geographic logistics involved. But then all of the factors that Theresa mentioned in terms of being reintegrated into a society if they do return, and being accepted into their former village or their family or their communities that they would have left behind, oftentimes many years before.
Well, to get some idea of the size of the task at hand when it comes to reintegrating former child soldiers into society, according to UNICEF, in the past 10 years, at least 65,000 children have been released from armed forces and armed groups. Almost a third of these are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are 9,000 in Central African Republic and more than 1,600 returned to civilian life in Chad. Theresa, how do you go about, I mean, you touched on it and some of the problems, but how do you go about integrating child soldiers back into society? How long does it take and whose responsibility is it?
Right. So the first step is really thinking about children returning to a normalizing and safe environment with attachment figures who are operating in their best interest and meeting their basic security needs. Certainly the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child enshrines the many rights that the world community has signed up for, with a few countries that have taken exception to signing and ratifying the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, including the United States. But we talk about the basic dimensions of children's security using the acronym SAFE. That in order to be stabilized, children need safety, freedom from harm. They need access to basic physiological needs, food, shelter, and an adequate standard of medical care. They need family and connection to others, attachment figures, and we need to really focus on the family and community environment when we think about reintegration. And then the other topic I was talking about, we need to focus on what's their sense of hope for the future? What is their access to education and economic security? That's the E and the SAFE, SAFE model. And these factors are interrelated and interdependent, and we see many times that young people are manipulated if they do not have basic security needs met. So young people can be drawn back into armed forces and armed groups if they don't have loving, committed attachment figures who are looking out for their best interests, or if they're unsafe, or if they don't have access to food and shelter. These things become much more able to be manipulated by third parties. Now, when it comes to reintegration programs, after access to a normalizing environment, returning home to some sort of attachment figure structure, and these can be very creative, these can be more communal. We've seen all sorts of different models. I think the model in Colombia is one of the more multi-level that I've seen that really addresses the issues of family, education, health, and economic security. We have to also address the trauma. And we are now working in Sierra Leone to adapt evidence-based mental health interventions based largely on community-based intervention using cognitive behavioral therapy, but also linking these opportunities back to school access and to access to livelihoods and adapting them to the culture and working very closely with community advisory boards and other stakeholders on the ground. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for the development community to make investments in programs like this that are evidence-based. We should really be seeing post-conflict environments left with strengthened health, mental health, social services, and education systems when we have children involved in this way. But as a development community, we tend to repeat this cycle of rapid humanitarian response, infusion of funds just at the moment of crisis, and failure to invest in sustainable systems of care for young people. And that's what's really needed to think about recovery, our access to sustainable systems of care that involve families and involve communities.
Finbarr, how many of these kids have mental health issues? What impact has their time as child soldiers had on their mental health?
Oh, it's had a massive impact. I lived and worked in Congo and Rwanda for 2 years, and I would go to these camps where the children were being demobilized. And as you heard from one of the Liberian child soldiers or former child soldiers, he said, he handed over his weapon, he got $150, but there's very little that's done for them afterwards. That money is going to be spent on subsistence. It's not going to be invested, or it's not enough to invest in even something as simple as buying a bicycle, so they may be able to start trading and doing some kind of business. But the emotional and psychological scars are such that they really need proper mental health care. And that can be provided certainly with the evidence-based kind of treatments that Theresa's talking about. But even on a much simpler level, you have things in say in northern Uganda, for example, the children seem to be much better reintegrated into society there than in a place like Liberia, where the war has really broke down all infrastructure. Uganda, although it's been torn by war for 20 years in the north, it does still have a certain amount of social and infrastructural cohesion. And one of the rituals that they've used there, Theresa, you probably encountered this, is the stepping on the egg, where children are brought back. And in the Acholi tribe, there's a tradition where people who've been traveling away and return home step on an egg, and that is meant to symbolize the chasing away of any evil spirits that they've picked up along the way. And that's now often used for returning child soldiers as a way of accepting them back into the community and making them feel welcome and accepted. And I think that's one of the things you heard from your former Liberian child soldier in the report just now, is that he doesn't feel accepted, he feels feared, and there aren't opportunities. But by being reintegrated in a way that they're accepted and forgiven, and provided with that sort of attachment to a community, that is a huge element of the basic level of social support that these children need in order to start having the kind of care that is required. And that'll also involve the kind of training and the kind of education that will allow them a sense of hope and a sense of opportunities, so that they don't return to this sort of downward spiral and cycle of crime that will be the reflex for children that have existed in a very violent kind of cycle for quite some time. So the emotional and psychological scars are huge and need to be addressed on multiple levels, but really feeling reintegrated and accepted and forgiven is the kind of the first step, I would say, in that process.
All right, Theresa, you wanted to come in there?
Yes, I'd like to add to that. I think with traditional healing ceremonies, we have seen them be able to play a very powerful role. But what we have to remember, and I did see this in northern Uganda, where it also became very gimmicky quite quickly, and they would round up hundreds of kids and do these stepping on egg ceremonies. And we have to remember that it has to come from the meaning making of the family and the community. It can't just be mechanistic. And so when a community and a family organizes a traditional healing ceremony on behalf of an individual young person, it can be tremendously powerful because it signals acceptance. But we can't do these sort of mass Vegas wedding style traditional healing ceremonies that are devoid of people's different belief systems. And there are many different religious and tribal backgrounds that we see amongst former child soldiers in different settings. So I would just put a little caveat around that it really has to come from the community, be something that they believe in and invest in, and it signals that acceptance to the young person.
And Finbarr, there have been various UN initiatives to prevent the conscription of children and to rehabilitate former child soldiers, but I need a brief answer from you, if you can give me one. Is enough being done?
Well, clearly not enough is being done, because this is a problem that continues. And in a lot of the countries that I've worked in and that we're discussing on this program, this is still a major, major issue, and certainly more needs to be done.
Theresa, would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. I think that we are continuing to repeat the same cycles of short-term infusion of funding and attention to issues with a very limited time horizon, and not strengthening the systems that will really matter for recovery over time, which includes social services, education, health, and mental health, and then attending to the involvement of communities and families in that process.
And who needs to pay for this? Who should be funding this rehabilitation? Very briefly, Theresa.
Yeah, we've been working in partnership with governments, most closely in Sierra Leone, have been in discussion with the World Bank, GIZ, other development actors about strengthening some of these social service and mental health programs, so that evidence-based mental health programs are integrated into livelihoods programs and into educational programs. So I think partnerships between governments and development actors can be extremely powerful, as well as public-private partnerships. And as you look in Sierra Leone at the workforce issues, in mining companies, in fruit manufacturing and other industries, there are real problems with engaging local youth because of some of these interpersonal issues that young people face because of trauma, problems with anger, problems with working well in groups, these sort of 21st century or soft skills which relate to mental health and relate to trauma. And we do have evidence-based interventions to address those topics and improve functioning, but we have to arrive at partnerships to get the sort of investments we need.
All right. There we must leave it. Theresa, Betancourt, Finbarr O'Reilly, many thanks indeed for being with us. Thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.